I didn't realize we were being watched until the first star disappeared. Not faded, not hidden behind a cloud. It simply ceased to exist while I was pointing at it. I remember laughing a second before it happened. Keir had insisted it wasn't a star at all. "It's a planet," he said, leaning back against a fallen log with a mug of coffee warming his hands. "You've said that about 3 different stars. They're not stars. They're definitely stars." He grinned. "Point at the brightest one." I did. There. We both looked up. The tiny white light sat perfectly still above the treetops. "You still think that's a planet?" Before he could answer, it blinked out. Neither of us spoke. The empty patch of sky looked wrong in a way I still can't explain. Your brain expects darkness between stars. It doesn't expect darkness where a star should be. I kept my finger raised for another few seconds, waiting. Nothing came back. If we'd packed our gear right then, none of the rest of this would have happened. Instead, we tried explaining it away. Keir and I had been hiking together for years, not because we were thrill seekers, quite the opposite. We picked quiet trails, unpopular campsites, and places where you could spend an entire weekend without hearing another group. That trip started with an old topographic map I'd bought from an estate sale. Most of the trails printed on it had been rerouted years ago, but one handwritten note in the margin caught my attention. It wasn't part of the original map. Someone had written it in faded blue ink. "Best place to watch the autumn sky." No name, no date, just that sentence with a tiny arrow pointing toward a ridge deep inside the forest. Keir thought it sounded interesting. I thought it sounded peaceful. Neither of us questioned why someone had written it there instead of keeping it to themselves. Looking back, maybe they weren't recommending it. Maybe they were documenting it. The hike in took a little over 3 hours. The trail was narrow but well-worn. No fallen trees blocking the way. No confusing intersections. Just endless pine forest broken occasionally by slabs of smooth gray rock. The strange thing wasn't what we saw. It was what we didn't. No squirrels. No birds hopping across the trail. No distant woodpeckers. Even the insects seemed quieter than they should have been. "You notice it?" I asked. Keir adjusted his backpack. "The silence." He nodded. "I figured we'd hear something by now." So did I. A breeze pushed gently through the pines. The branches swayed. We heard every needle brushing against another. But no living thing answered. A few minutes later, we rounded a bend and found the only other person we'd see that day. An elderly man sat on a flat boulder just off the trail. He wasn't resting. He wasn't eating. He was just looking up, not at us, at the sky. He didn't react until we were almost beside him. "Afternoon," Keir said. The man nodded slowly. "You camping?" "That's the plan." His eyes drifted toward the ridge behind us. "Stay below the trees after sunset." Keir smiled politely. "We're actually camping on the ridge." The man's expression didn't change. I wouldn't. I expected him to explain. He didn't. Instead, he stood, brushed pine needles from his jacket, and started walking downhill. After a few steps, he stopped without turning around. "If the stars begin disappearing," he hesitated. "Don't keep counting." Then he continued down the trail until the trees swallowed him. Neither of us moved. Keir finally laughed. "That guy rehearses that speech." "I hope so." Neither of us believed what we just heard, but neither of us forgot it. We reached the ridge about an hour before sunset. It was beautiful. A broad shelf of granite overlooked miles of forest rolling toward distant hills. There were no picnic tables, no numbered campsite, just an old stone fire ring and enough flat ground for one tent. "This has to be it," Keir said. "The map." I unfolded the old paper. The handwritten arrow pointed directly at the clearing. We dropped our packs, set up the tent, collected dead branches, cooked dehydrated stew that tasted far better than it deserved. As daylight faded, the forest settled into evening. At first everything felt normal. Wind in the trees, the occasional chirp of insects, the quiet crackle of burning wood. Then, almost without noticing, the sounds began disappearing. Not all at once. One at a time. The insects stopped first. A few minutes later, no wind. The fire still burned, but the smoke rose perfectly straight into the air. Not leaning, not twisting, straight. Keir noticed it before I did. Look at that. I stared at the column of smoke. There isn't any wind. There was a minute ago. We waited. Nothing changed. It was as though the entire ridge had slipped inside a bubble where the air no longer moved. Then something fluttered above us. A flock of small birds burst from the treetops. At least 30 of them. They climbed sharply into the evening sky. For a second, I assumed they'd disappear into the distance. Instead, every bird reached roughly the same height. Every single one banked hard to the left at exactly the same moment. Not one flew higher. It looked less like they had changed direction, and more like they'd hit something invisible. What was that? Keir asked quietly. I don't know. Neither did he. We watched until the flock disappeared over the forest. Neither of us noticed we were both looking upward now. The stars were beginning to appear. One by one. Hundreds of them. The sky was unbelievably clear. Keir smiled. Maybe the old guy was right about one thing. What? This might be the best place I've ever seen for stargazing. I looked up, found the brightest point above the clearing, raised my finger. There. He followed my hand. The star shone brilliantly for another second. Then it vanished. Not dimmed. Not drifted behind a cloud. It was simply gone. Keir frowned. Torin. I know. No. His voice had changed. He wasn't looking where I was. He was looking at my shadow. I turned toward the campfire. The flames were still burning, bright enough to cast light across the entire clearing. But my shadow had disappeared. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I looked from the fire to the ground and back again. The flames were high enough to throw light across the campsite. Keir still had a shadow. The tent had one too. The cooler. The chairs. Even the pine tree beside the fire cast a long black shape across the granite. I walked closer to the flames. Nothing. I stepped away. Still nothing. Keir stared at the ground, then back at me. How is that possible? I forced a laugh that sounded fake even to me. Maybe it's the angle. The angle doesn't erase one shadow. He was right. There wasn't a single explanation that made sense. Then, my shadow returned. It slid across the rock beneath me so suddenly it made me jump. Not gradually. Instantly. As if someone had flipped a switch. Neither of us said another word. I want to try something. Keir unscrewed his metal water bottle and filled the lid from it. The water settled into a perfectly still mirror. Look! I leaned over. The reflection showed the entire night sky. Thousands of stars. Every one of them. I looked up. The missing star was still gone. Back into the water. It was there again. I blinked several times. The reflection never changed. The water insisted the sky was normal. Reality insisted it wasn't. Keir slowly poured the water onto the ground. I don't like that. I don't either. He pulled out his phone. No reflections. No cameras. We're checking. He took a photo. The image looked completely normal. Perfect autumn sky. He zoomed in. First, nothing seemed unusual. Then he stopped moving. What? Come here. I looked over his shoulder. Running diagonally across the image, barely visible, was a smooth, curved line. Not black, not bright, just a subtle distortion, like looking through thick glass. What is that? I thought it was a scratch. He zoomed further. The curve continued, farther than the photo could capture, almost as though we'd photographed the edge of something impossibly large. Then the phone froze. The screen flickered once. The photo disappeared. Neither of us had deleted it. The phone simply acted as if it had never been taken. We're leaving. This time, neither of us pretended to debate it. The backpacks stayed open, sleeping bags half-rolled, food scattered across the granite. We didn't care. I kicked dirt over the fire. The flames died with a sharp hiss. Darkness settled over the clearing. I switched on my flashlight. The beam swept across the tent. The chairs, the trees, everything looked normal, until I tilted the light upward. The beam climbed the nearest pine trunk. 10 feet, 20, 30, then stopped. Not because the tree ended, because the light did. Above that point, nothing. The flashlight simply ceased to exist. It wasn't fading. It wasn't getting weaker. It was as if someone had cut the beam in half. Keir raised his own flashlight. Exactly the same. Neither beam reached the branches. Both ended at precisely the same height. We looked at each other. Neither of us wanted to say it. So I finally did. There's something above the trees. We left the campsite at a brisk walk. Neither of us wanted to run. Running meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. The trail descended through dense pine before opening briefly onto a rocky overlook. I glanced upward. Every star was back. I stopped walking. They're back. Keir looked. They're all back. For the first time in almost an hour, I smiled. So it was the campsite. Maybe. We stood there for another few seconds, waiting. Nothing changed. The stars remained exactly where they should be. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then Keir frowned. Torin, what now? Look at Orion. I don't know where Orion is. I do. He pointed. The belt. 3 bright stars. Perfectly aligned. I found them immediately. Except, there were only 2. I looked away. Looked back. Still 2. Another point of light disappeared beside them. Not over the campsite. Not over us. Somewhere much farther away. The darkness hadn't followed. It had spread. We kept moving. The forest remained unnaturally quiet. No wind. No insects. No distant streams. Only our boots against the dirt. Then something changed. The silence became heavier. It's difficult to explain. It wasn't that we heard less. It was that the forest stopped producing echoes. I tested it without thinking. Keir. Nothing came back. Not even the faintest reflection of my own voice. He stared at me. Do it again. I shouted his name. The sound traveled into the trees. Then stopped. No echo. No fading. Just gone. Keir picked up a loose stone and threw it into the darkness ahead. We both listened. No impact. No bounce. No rolling. The rock simply vanished from the world the moment it left our sight. Neither of us walked forward for several seconds. Finally, Keir whispered, I don't think the forest is getting quieter. I looked at him. His face had gone pale. I think something is taking the sound. We hurried downhill. The trail curved sharply around a stand of pines. That's when Keir grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. He wasn't looking at the trail. He was looking straight up. I followed his gaze. At first, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted. The missing stars weren't random anymore. They formed an edge. A gigantic, perfectly smooth, curved edge. My eyes tried to measure it. They couldn't. It stretched beyond what I could see in every direction. It wasn't a cloud. It wasn't darkness. It was the outline of something so unimaginably large that my brain kept rejecting it. Keir didn't blink. He whispered just 4 words. Torin, that's not the sky. And then, the curve moved. The curve moved. Not fast. Not slowly either. It drifted with the kind of certainty that made speed irrelevant. For one impossible moment, my brain tried to convince me the Earth itself had shifted. Then another star disappeared. Not beneath the curve. Ahead of it. Whatever we were looking at wasn't uncovering the sky. It was covering it. Keir took 1 step backward. Then another. His breathing became shallow. Don't, I said quietly. He didn't answer. His eyes never left the thing above us. Keir. Still nothing. I grabbed his shoulder. He flinched so hard he almost fell. Don't look at it, I snapped. He blinked several times before finally looking at me. His face had completely drained of color. What did you see? I asked. He swallowed. I don't know. Try. He stared at the ground. It wasn't black. I frowned. What? It only looked black because... He stopped himself. Because what? His voice was barely a whisper. Because there's nothing for it to reflect. A chill ran through me. He wasn't describing a cloud. Or darkness. He was describing a surface. Something solid. Something so large it blocked an entire section of the universe. We're leaving, I said. No matter what happens, don't look up again. He nodded once. I won't. We broke into a run. The trail dropped steeply through the pines, our flashlights bouncing wildly with every step. The strange thing was, the beams still ended at exactly the same height. Every tree looked as though someone had sliced its top half away. I focused on the trail. Roots, loose stones, anything except the sky. Behind us, the forest remained silent. No footsteps, no crashing through brush, no pursuit. That frightened me more than anything. Felt like nothing needed to chase us. It already knew where we were. A gust of wind finally rushed through the trees. The first we'd felt in over an hour. Leaves scattered across the trail. The branches above us swayed violently. For 1 second, I felt relieved. The forest sounded alive again. Then every branch bent the same direction. Not with the wind, toward the sky. Thousands of pine branches, tilting upward, like compass needles finding north. Then, just as suddenly, they relaxed. The wind stopped. Everything became still again. Neither of us mentioned what we'd seen. Some things become more frightening when spoken aloud. The parking area appeared through the trees. I had never been happier to see cracked gravel. My truck sat exactly where we'd left it. The old pickup from earlier was still there too. Only now, its windshield reflected a sky filled with stars. Every single one. I looked up instinctively. Half of them were gone. I looked back at the windshield. They were all there. Don't, Keir warned. Just get in. I didn't argue. We threw our packs into the truck bed and climbed inside. My hands shook so badly I stalled the engine once before finally getting it started. As we pulled away, the headlights swept across the ridge we just left. For less than a heartbeat, the beams caught something impossible. Not a face, not eyes, not a creature, just an edge, perfectly smooth, curving across the sky beyond the reach of our lights. Then the truck rounded the bend, and it was gone. Neither of us spoke during the drive home. The radio stayed off. The silence inside the cab felt safer than any conversation. About 40 minutes later, Keir finally broke it. Promise me something. What? If anyone asks why we left, we say the weather changed. He nodded. And if they ask where we camped, we don't tell them. That was the last time we ever discussed that night. At least, in person. Almost 6 months passed before I thought about it again. I was organizing old files when I found the dashcam recording from the trip. I nearly deleted it. Instead, I watched. The footage looked completely ordinary. Us loading the truck, the headlights, the drive away. Then I remembered the moment our lights swept across the ridge. I paused the video, frame by frame. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Then, one frame, just one. The automatic exposure adjusted for a fraction of a second. Long enough to reveal what our eyes never fully could. The missing stars weren't random. They ended along an impossibly smooth curve. And inside that curve, the stars weren't hidden. They were absent, as though something unimaginably vast occupied that space instead. I enlarged the image, not because I wanted answers, because I wanted proof I wasn't imagining it. The more I zoomed, the less the image made sense. The pixels blurred. The edge remained perfectly smooth, almost mathematical. I closed the laptop and didn't open the file again. Last month, Keir called me for the first time in almost a year. He didn't ask how I'd been. He didn't talk about work. The first thing he said was, "I stopped looking at the stars." I waited. He laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because he sounded embarrassed. "My daughter wanted me to help her find constellations last night." "What happened?" "I couldn't." "Why?" There was a long silence. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I don't know which stars I used to trust." We never spoke about that night again. I still camp, just not on ridges, not in wide-open clearings, and never anywhere people describe as having the best view of the night sky. Sometimes, when I step outside after dark, I catch myself looking up without thinking. Then I remember what the old man said on the trail. He didn't warn us that the stars would disappear. He warned us not to keep counting. Back then, I thought he was trying to stop us from panicking. Now, I think he knew something far worse. If you keep counting, eventually, you'll notice one disappears. And if you wait long enough, you might realize it wasn't the stars that were moving. If the story kept you looking over your shoulder, or made you think twice about the next time you look up into a clear night sky, I'd love to have you back around the campfire. Subscribe to the Forgotten Campsite for more slow-burn camping horror stories where the wilderness keeps its secrets, and not everyone who finds them understands what they saw. And before you leave, tell me in the comments, if you had been in Torin and Keir's place, would you have looked up one more time?